Hi, this is Johnny. I'm going to be talking through the elementary literacy task for edTPA, the first task of the 3 literacy tasks required. And let's get started. I want to focus on a note down here on the first page from the handbook. At the bottom here, it says the 3 elementary literacy tasks can be completed before or after you complete the elementary mathematics assessment task. But materials for all tasks must be submitted for official scoring during the same scoring submission window. So keep this in mind. The math and literacy can be done in either order, but you're submitting everything at the same time. Let's get started. Each one of the tasks is organized this way. There are 4 parts. The first 2 parts are what do I need to think about? And the second part is what do I need to do? So let's focus on the what do I need to think about first. In Literacy Planning Task 1, you will describe your plans for the learning segment and explain how your instruction is appropriate for the students and the content you are teaching. As you develop your plans, you need to think about the following. And there's a bulleted list. Whenever there's a bulleted list in edTPA, pay close attention. Make sure you're using it as a checklist. It's a smart way to go. Let's take a look at what we have here. First off, you want to start with what do your students know, what can they do, and what they're learning to do. You want to think about your students as capable and bringing something to the learning. They're not blank slates. Second one, what do you want your students to learn? So important. What are the important understandings and core concepts you want students to develop within the learning segment? You're not teaching something ordinary, something every day. Try to reach for something that has rich ideas in it and will allow kids, your students, to display rich understandings. That will make this process work better, but it also will help your teaching. You want to think about what assets your students bring to the learning, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. In your planning, you want to consider strategies, learning tasks, and assessments. And then you want to think about how your learning segment will support students to develop and use language that deepens content understanding. As you'll find out throughout the edTPA, language matters, academic language matters, and is a key consideration throughout all your work through this performance assessment. And you will need to attach your ideas and your suggestions for reteaching and such. You need to support those with research and theory. All right? Let's go to the what do I need to do part. Very pragmatic part. First off, you're going to need a class. And this class has to have at least 4 students. So if you're in a primary classroom or even an intermediate classroom and you have a group of 5, 6, 7 kids, that could be considered a whole class, but you have to have a minimum of at least 4. You will also need to provide context information using the Elementary Literacy Context for Learning, and that's a form to fill out. Pay attention to page numbers, so this context for learning can only have 4 pages, no more than that. And then you want to do the work. Identify a learning segment to teach, teach, and analyze. And this should be framed around 3 consecutive lessons. All right? So let's look at the big ideas here. First off, we want to start with what you need to know about your students. You need to know what they know, what they can do, and what they're learning to do. So think about your students as being in the midst of a learning event, and they bring learning to it, they're capable, and there are things for them to learn. Start with those things in mind. We also want to think about what students bring to the learning. We'll talk about assets in a little bit, but you want to think about students as having something to take into the learning. And from what they bring to the learning, you need to consider your own frames around language and around instruction and around supporting them along the way. And lastly, you want to set yourself up to teach one class and describe the students in that class and the literacy program, which could be spelled better. So hold those things in mind as we get going. Okay. Now we're getting into the meat of things here. This is where things get a bit thick, so I'm going to give some detail to each of these parts. Let's start at the top up here. It says identify a central focus. Okay, I'm going to give a description of that based on the glossary in a moment. And this central focus needs to have certain parts to it, right? So the central focus should have a literacy strategy, an essential literacy strategy. And the essential literacy strategy should focus on comprehending text or composing text. And you can see the guide gives you ideas about what that might be. So comprehending text might be summarizing a story, and composing text might be using evidence to support an argument. Now this is important. This is the and. It's not just essential literacy strategy. You also need to think about the skills that support that essential literacy strategy. All right? And the examples they give here, related skills, the ideas of decoding, recalling, sequencing, writing conventions, writing paragraphs, all the practical things that might get you to the ability to summarize a story or to use evidence to support an argument. All right? So I need to hold these together. The big ideas and the supporting skills that support that. All right? Next thing we need to consider are the content standards. And these content standards should be drawn from your state standards, Common Core or whatever standards you have. So you're giving it some validity, the teaching you're doing, by working from the expected standards from the state. Now here's a very special caveat here in this next line. If you're in a teaching situation where you're expected to teach literacy through some other content subject, like social studies or science, you have to be very, very careful that what you're teaching is literacy focused. Okay, you must be very clear that it's about literacy. It can be about historical fiction, it can be about reading nonfiction texts, it could be a lot of things, but the focus has to be on literacy. All right? Okay, let's go to the next piece. And each of these I'll be describing a bit more, especially this one's I'm going to give more detail on this one in a moment. So you want to identify and plan to support language demands. We'll talk about what language demands are in a moment. We need to think about what a key language function will be. Again, I'll describe those in a moment. And you want to choose a learning task that provides opportunities for students to practice using that language function. Okay, language functions are like explaining and describing and justifying. More detail in a moment. You want to also talk about the demands that go along with working that language function. Okay, I'll talk about that in a moment as well. You want to support the language use in your classroom. I'll give you lots more detail in just a moment. So let's go to the next part. The next part is writing a lesson plan. You want to write a lesson plan for each lesson in the learning segment. You want those plans to be detailed enough that a substitute or another teacher could use them, right? Now, here are the important parts. Your lesson plan must include the following information. So be careful here because you may be working from a lesson plan template and you might have to alter that template, or you might ask for a different kind of form or template for planning lessons from your advisor or mentor. But you must address these bulleted points here, all right? So somewhere in your lesson plan you must address what content standards you're working from. You must set out learning objectives, and these must be associated with the content standards, so you want these two to line up. Okay. You want to set out what your formal and informal assessments will be. So as much as you want to say, as important it is to say what the final thing is, what the final write-up will be, or the final test might be, you need to be writing about what quizzes, what checks for understandings, what exit tickets, all those kinds of things along the way that you might use to see where how kids are doing along through the course of your 3 to 5 lessons. You need to be thinking about informal assessments as much as the formal assessments. You can set out your instructional strategies and learning tasks, as well as your instructional resources and materials. Lastly, you have to make sure none of the lesson plans is greater than 4 pages in length. All right? That should be doable. So here's some things to think about. First, the central focus must include an essential literacy strategy and related skills. You have to think about those two as always going together. All right? Next, you want to give special consideration to how language will matter in your lessons. So as you're lesson planning, Don't think about the language as, oh, I'll add that later. It needs to be embedded in the planning throughout. The next piece, you need to determine the key language function that will matter throughout the learning segment. And you need to plan supports for that language function. And lastly, make sure your lesson plans hit each of the bulleted points here. All right? So just use it as a checklist. If you have all of those things in, then you're doing fine. All right. To continue, so there are a number of things you have to consider along the way here. The first being, you need to write your comment, you need to adjust the commentary prompts from task 1 before you teach. All right? Don't do it as an afterthought because it will be plain, but you're trying to think about this first task as a planning task, and you're trying to improve and grow in your ability to plan. You want to submit your original lesson plans, and there's a little note here. If you have to make changes in your plans later on, which is what real teachers do, is actual teaching, then you need to address those in a commentary place. You want to select and submit key instructional materials. A thought for you is you want to take pictures of everything, every worksheet, everything that you write on the board, as any kind of charts you intend to use. Include images of those, PDFs of those, and you can see some of the suggestions: class handouts, assignments, slides, interactive whiteboard images. So you want to take a picture of those things. Submit copies of all written assessments and/or directions for any oral or performance assessments. And then, if you use other materials, do provide citations. All right? Now we get to the third part of this task, and it's the what do I need to write part. And this one's going to be very elaborate. So we're going to take some time with this one, all right? First off, the first thing that you'll need to be doing is providing the context for learning. Okay? And that's one of the forms that is available to you. Lets you tell the reader of your edTPA assessment, what your class is like, what's a literacy program like, who your kids are. Submit your lesson plans, and then of course the commentary, which is what comes next, the literacy planning commentary. So this is probably the most important part of each task. This is the evidence that you're giving for your thinking and your organization for your teaching. And so give good attention to your literacy planning, or give good attention to all the commentaries throughout your edTPA. So let's go through the literacy planning commentary. The first thing you'll notice is our page limits. And try to stay within the 9 pages. If you write too much the first time, you can always edit later on. If you write too little, then you might be thinking about, did I really fully address each of the prompts? And so that's my main suggestion throughout here, is that you need to address every single part of every prompt, okay, with specific detail and evidence from your teaching. All right? Next, let's talk about the central focus. And I'm going to talk about this more than once, but let's look at this together. The central focus and the essential literacy strategy for comprehending and composing text. So you need to describe these. So you want to write out in detail what is your central focus and the essential literacy strategy for comprehending and composing text. Set it out clearly as the objective you have for the teaching you're doing in this segment. Next, starting with the central focus that you have, describe how the standards and learning objectives you have in your lesson plan address each of these. Okay. Now again, if there's a bulleted list here, you want to address each one of them. So the first thing is describe how the standards and learning objectives address the essential literacy strategy, how the standards and learning objectives address the related skills, how the standards and learning objectives address reading and writing connections. All right. And then next, you need to talk about how your plans build on each other to help students make connections between the essential literacy strategy and the related skills. Remember, essential literacy strategy and related skills always go together. You need to think about both of them together. Now, the building upon part, you want to think about a suggestion is that you start with what did students bring to their lesson, what did you build on before they even came to the lessons you're teaching. But then each subsequent lesson after the first builds on the prior ones. Lesson 2 built on the first lesson by, lesson 3 built on the prior lessons by, and you want to make sure you're addressing the essential literacy strategy and the related skills in each one of those descriptions, all right? Let's go to the next piece. Knowledge of students. This is why it's important to be teaching a class you're familiar with and have worked with for a bit of time, because then you can address this well. So you want to describe what you know about your students with respect to the central focus again, all right? And I'm going to talk about the central focus in a moment. Just remember the central focus is the big idea of your lesson sequence. Throughout the edTPA, you'll see this inset that says, consider the variety of learners. And this is something you should know from the context of learning work that you've done before. You want to have in mind throughout all 4 tasks the different kids in your class, all the different kids in your class. So kids with IEPs, 504s, 504 plans, English learners, struggling readers, kids with missing bits in their academic careers or knowledge, and kids who are doing well by things. You want to have a good sense of your kids. So what edTPA hopes for here is that you're starting from a notion that not all of your kids are the same, that you're going to be planning for the variety of kids in your classroom. And following that, you want to be thinking about the prior academic learning that they bring to the teaching that you're going to be doing in terms of what they know, what they can do, and then again what they are learning to do, okay? So start with kids as capable and able, and what are they learning to do through the sequence that you're setting out for them. And then here it says personal, cultural, and community assets. What do you know about your students' everyday experiences, cultural and language backgrounds, and practices and interests? Okay, so this is again knowing your kids. Now this is how edTPA describes these. So let's take a look here. What you can see from edTPA's glossary, personal refers to specific background information that students bring to the learning environment, their particular interests, knowledge, and everyday experiences, their own family backgrounds, okay? So what is it about each and every one of your kids, knowing something about them? Next, cultural refers to the cultural backgrounds and practices that students bring to the learning environment. So this includes traditions, languages, and dialects, worldviews, literatures they've been exposed to, okay? And then community. What is it about your school community and the neighborhood where your kids are coming from that could be considered a resource or an asset that they bring to their learning? All right? Okay. Now I'm going to go into more detail about items from the previous page. And I threw out central focus before as the idea of it being something important and big. Let's take a look at it, okay? The central focus. The central focus is a description of the important understandings and core concepts. So what are the big ideas that you're reaching for? All right? And this next part that's highlighted here, the central focus should go beyond a list of facts and skills. Okay, let's start with that first one. That's probably the most important one. If you're really reaching for something that's worth understanding, that's something that's important, then it should be more than just a list of facts and skills. Facts and skills might be considered related skills rather than the central focus. You can think about learning facts and skills as supporting a big idea, but the facts and skills themselves should not be the central focus. You can see that the central focus should align with the content standards. Content standards are often written that way, with a central focus, a big idea. And, you know, the central focus should matter to the subject matter. Since you're doing literacy, how is this central to learning to read and to write? Okay. Now, let's think about these in turn. What does this mean for the work you have to do? Let's start off with this first one. In elementary literacy, the central focus is an overarching big idea for student learning and literacy. And it has 2 parts, an essential literacy strategy and a related skills. Those always go together, so hold those together. Now what's useful here is that edTPA sets out examples. So let's start with the first one. They give you an example of what the central focus might be for a primary grade. And they suggest that a central focus for a primary grade might be on retelling. And the learning segment would focus on the essential literacy strategy. The essential literacy strategy for this primary grade activity might be summarizing. So we've gone from retelling to summarizing. And then there would be related skills. Related skills in conjunction with summarizing would be decoding, recalling, and sequencing. So we've gone from central focus to essential literacy strategy to related skills. And this is an example for primary. Now we also have an example for intermediate. So let's take a look at this one. Under the intermediate example, you see that the central focus for an upper elementary learning segment might be persuasive writing. Falling from that, the essential literacy strategy might be using evidence to support an argument. And the related skills would be writing paragraphs, using correct verb tense, and other conventions. All right? So this chart down here sets out that frame, starting with essential focus. What's the essential literacy strategy? What are the related skills that support that? Now, you also have to consider what the standards and lesson objectives are, and the language function. We'll talk about language function in a moment. And just a little bit of a review. We can see the primary example using this chart starts with the central focus where we're retelling a story. The essential literacy strategy is summarizing the story, and the related skills are decoding, recalling, and sequencing. All right? Now for the upper grade, looking at the example again, they've written them out for us. So the essential focus is persuasive writing. The essential literacy strategy would be constructing an argument. Related skills, identifying features of an argument, writing topic and transitional sentences, understanding writing conventions. Okay? Now they've added the two pieces down here that matter. So the standards and lesson objectives would be based on states and on state expectations and individual lessons. But you can see the language function, how students will use language to perform the essential literacy strategy. They'll be doing that through persuading, arguing, or justifying. So one of those would be the language function that would matter to this set of lessons. Now, let's continue through the commentary. The next piece is about supporting students' literacy learning. Okay, there's a piece here that can be confusing sometimes, so I just want to set this out here. As you go through this work, consider the theory and research that supports your ideas, the justifications for your planning. A lot about the planning task is stating why your plans are appropriate for your kids. One way to think about that is why it's appropriate for your kids based on who they are. The other way to think about it is why are your plans appropriate based on research and theory about the content or about pedagogy. All right? So let's continue. Now, the next part talks about students' assets. Justify how your understanding of your students' prior academic learning and personal community, cultural, and community assets. Okay, we talked about those a moment ago. Guided your choice or adaptation of learning tasks and materials. Okay, so you want to be explicit about the connections between learning tasks and students' prior academic learning, their assets, and research theory. Okay, so let's think about this in terms of three pieces. Where are the students coming from in their learning? Who are they and what do they care about? And what does theory or research offer us to help in our teaching of them? All right, so keep those in mind. Now the next part is something you have to consider throughout the edTPA and sometimes gets lost. You need to be able to describe what you're doing for not just one student, but for different configurations of students. So describe and justify why your instructional strategies and plan supports are appropriate for whole class, okay, the whole class, individuals and or groups, okay. This is important because you'll be looking at a group of students as part of your analysis. So you need to think about your lessons as not being just for a whole class, but setting out a whole class lesson that meets and addresses the interests and needs of all your students in all the different groups they might be in, or particular individual students. Again, the inset, consider the variety of learners. This can be understood from your context of learning exercise. Okay, the next piece is a little tricky. You want to consider developmental approximations and misconceptions, and I'll let edTPA describe this. Let's take a look at this, please. All right. So let me get this right for you. So if we want to think about misconceptions, for literacy, this includes confusion about a strategy or skill, and misunderstanding about text purposes and structures, application of a skill or multiple meaning words. We'll talk about mathematics in turn. Okay, so what is it that comes along for you in your teaching that a lot of kids are misunderstanding because it comes about in the nature of the teaching of that subject? So misconception is something that is often misunderstood or taken to a different kind of understanding by the nature of the subject itself, right? Developmental approximations, including transitional spelling or other attempts to use skills or strategies just beyond a student's current level of capability. Another way to think about this is consider how old your kids are and what kinds of things they might or should be learning at the level or age at which they are. So hold on to those. Now I'm going to move on to the supporting literacy development through language, and I'm going to talk through this portion here, but then I'm going to go into it in more detail as well. So each one of these terms is laden, a little bit complicated, so you might have to think this through a couple times, read the glossary for yourself. But let's go ahead and start. All right? So as you look at the inset, it says, as you respond to the following problems, consider the range of students' language assets and needs. So again, assets and needs. What do they already know? What are they struggling with? Or what is new to them? Always keep those things in mind. Let's talk about the parts, the considerations for language now. The first one is the language function. Okay? In the language function, you want to think about it as being a verb, and you can see the list that they have here. You want to identify one language function, not a bunch of different ones, but you want to think about the use of language, how language is being used to support and practice the literacy strategy and central focus that you're working on. Okay? So, as was described earlier, if you're retelling a story, if that's the focus, then the language function will be summarizing, okay? Right, so you need to think about just one in particular, and the one that's going to be overarching because you're going to need to be focused on it quite a lot, right? What's the key language function students will have to exercise and practice throughout your teaching sequence? Starting and working from that, you want to think about a key learning task where students will be using that particular function in a way that supports the essential literacy strategy. And just to set you up and help you think about this, you want this to be where you want to have your video recording, and you want to be collecting your evidence too, whether it's with audio recording or student work. So you want to make sure that your assessment lines up with your essential literacy strategy and the chance or the opportunity you give students to practice that. All right, and one more piece here before we go into it in a bit more detail. Additional language demands. And these concerns are vocabulary, syntax, and discourse, and I'll describe those in a moment. But let's go through this again, okay? So you have language function, which is going to be one of these verbs, and then additional language demands, which will be the consideration of these: vocabulary, syntax, discourse. All right, so hold these in order: language function, which is a verb, additional language demands, vocabulary, syntax, or discourse. All right. Let's go to the next piece. Now these are the definitions that are set out in the glossary, so let's take each one in turn. Okay? So the first one, academic language. So they describe it, define it as oral and written language used for academic purposes. So hold on to that, that's the essential definition. And further, you can think about it as the language that is used by students as they develop and express content understanding. So you can think about the language that might be wrapped around science, or the language that's wrapped around literary interpretation, or social studies, or math. It's the language of the discipline, and having that language allows somebody to participate in talk and ideas and thinking about that discipline. All right, so think about how scientists talk, mathematicians talk, or literary critics talk as academic language. Let's go through the next one. So we talk about language demands. Whenever language demands is described, it's the specific ways that academic language is used by students to participate in learning tasks. Okay, so what is the language that's required for them to do the learning? And then going through the next one, the language function. Elaborate on the definition from before. Okay, and edTPA describes it as the language functions are represented by the active verbs within the learning outcomes that are involved with language. Okay, and edTPA gives some description here. Common language functions in language arts include identifying, analyzing, interpreting, arguing, predicting, evaluating, interpreting, or comparing. And you're welcome to use any of these. So you see any of these particular ones, or in the list from the page before, that's a great language function to work from. Now, vocabulary is a bit tricky, so let's think about this in turn, because vocabulary is not as simple as just knowing the definitions of things, especially in terms of academic language. Okay? The way we're thinking about it here is vocabulary are the words and phrases that are used within the disciplines. So in the study of text or in the writing of text, what kinds of vocabulary matters? So some words have some vocabulary in disciplines have subject-specific meanings, okay? And they change from discipline to discipline. So the example they give us is the word table. And table in an everyday setting is something we set our meals on. Table in the context of science or math is something very different. So that's one way to think about vocabulary. So there's everyday vocabulary that has subject-specific meanings. The second consideration we have is that some academic vocabulary can be used across disciplines. So compare, analyze, and evaluate can happen across literacy, across science, across math. But then there are some words that are very specific to disciplines. Okay, so you might think about the coordinate pair or something like that in mathematics is very specific to mathematics. So let's consider discourse. Now, discourse is a broader term. So discourse is how language is wrapped around the activity of people interacting around something. So let's think about this. So edTPA describes this as the structures of written and oral language, as well as how members of the discipline talk, write, and participate in knowledge construction. So this is how people use language around their work, around their interactions within any particular discipline. So again, how scientists talk to each other about science, how writers talk to each other about writing. You can think about discipline-specific discourse has specific features, okay? The way that scientists might talk about something and the ways they support their ideas with evidence or question each other would be different than the ways that writers might support each other to talk to each other about evidence or making conjectures or asking questions. Okay, so discipline-specific discourse has distinctive features or ways of structuring oral or written language that provide useful ways for the content to be communicated. All right? So they use the term text structures, which is discipline specific in of itself, which is a little bit ironic. Okay, so examples here. In the language arts and literacy, there are structures for composing, interpreting, and comprehending expository, narrative, poetic, journalistic, and graphic print materials, as well as video and live presentations. How people talk about things. Another way to think about this is if you imagine artists having an art critique about somebody's work, they'd have a very particular way of talking about things. If you were in a book club is sitting and sharing an evening talking about a book. The ways that people would talk about a book would be the discourse that goes with literary interpretation. All right? So let's continue. Next, we might think about syntax. And syntax, the set of conventions for organizing symbols, words, and phrases together into structures. And so the examples here will help. Sentences, graphs, tables. So any time in which you organize the words in a certain order or frame or hierarchy, any of those organizing structures that give the text added meaning, that means that's the syntax of it, okay? And the syntax could be within a sentence. The way that you've organized the words within a sentence gives it meaning. Reorganizing it, reordering the text gives a different syntax, meaning that you might have a different meaning. So how is text organized to give meaning? So hold on to that. And the last one, this is more practical. These are the things you're doing in your teaching. So the last one is the language supports. The scaffolds, representations, and pedagogical strategies teachers provide to help learners understand, use, and practice the concepts and language they need to learn within the disciplines. So there might be some organizing structure around paragraph form, there might be sentence frames, there might be some kind of word wall, any kind of thing that you might use that supports the language use in your classroom would be a scaffold or language support. All right? And then here, top of this page, language supports. You want to write out what those language supports are. You want to identify and describe them. Okay. And when you describe them, you might want to think about how those supports are set up to support specific kids in specific ways. All right. Why are you choosing these supports to support the whole class or particular groups of kids along the way? And your supports should try to address the function, supports addressing vocabulary, supports for discourse, supports for syntax. All right, so consider all of those. Next, the fifth one, the fifth prompt. Make sure you do both of these and make sure you do them in the right order. So the first one, you want to write out fully before you write out the second one. And this one says, describe how you planned formal and informal assessments, how your informal and informal assessments provide direct evidence that students can use the essential literacy strategy to comprehend or compose text, right? So, you're setting out your lesson plans beforehand, and deep and essential to those lesson plans should be what your formal and informal assessments are. And again, let's keep in mind, you need to have some formal assessment that can be addressed through your analysis, but you want to have informal assessments along the way for checks for understanding, and in particular you want to set yourself up so that you have opportunities to give students feedback along the way. Feedback will matter a lot, so make sure you have both of those things embedded in your planning. Okay? And then the other part, so make sure you completely write that one out, but then you need to address particular kids again, and here's the inset. Consider all your learners. Consider these groups of learners and the different configurations within your classroom. How are you addressing kids with specific needs? A suggestion would be that you consider more than one group. Think of different organizations of kids within your classroom. And this includes kids who are quite capable as well. Now, I want to go back up here to the formal and informal assessments piece, because sometimes the difference is a little confused. This is how edTPA sets this out. So what edTPA says, assessment, summative and formative. Summative means the kind of test or assessment you give at the end to see how someone's done at the conclusion of a unit of study. And formative are the kinds of assessments that are done in support of learning along the way. Okay? So they give definitions here. Summative assessments are given periodically to determine at a particular point in time what students know and do not know relative to content standards. Okay? So you can see chapter tests, unit tests, culminating projects. Formative assessments are incorporated into the classroom practice and can provide information needed to adjust teaching and learning as students approach full mastery of content. Okay, and examples here, observations, questioning strategies, peer, self and peer assessments. Now, the importance of formative assessments is it's very important, because this shows how much you are paying attention to. The formative assessments are tools you use to measure the effectiveness of your teaching along the way. And there's a lot of self-reflection along the way that you need to do to continually to address what students are doing and learning along the way. So you can imagine in your first lesson that you set out formative assessments that will give you information that will let you know what kinds of adjustments or changes or additions you might need for the second lesson, right? So as I shared earlier about the planning cycle, you know that after instruction you have assessment. The assessment can be ongoing, and those assessments, ongoing assessments, feed into your planning for subsequent lessons, even within a short sequence of lessons. So keep those things in mind. Now, I'm going to go over the literacy rubrics. All right, so there are 5 of these. And as I've suggested before, you should be looking at these at the front end of your teaching. So let's start here. This is the first rubric, Planning for Literacy Learning. And the question is, how does the candidate's plans build students' understanding of an essential literacy strategy for comprehending or composing text and the skills that support that strategy? So be careful with and, because and always means they want more than one thing. And we've talked about it throughout. You need to be thinking about the essential literacy strategy and the related skills. Okay? Now, you can see what 3 is. And I'm going to be honest, I think 3 is very basic. It's okay, but it's not really a reach. If you're using edTPA, as you should, to make yourself into a better teacher, then you should at least be trying for a 4. And I'm going to talk about the criteria for 4 so you can shoot for 4. So let's take a look at level 4. If we look at level 4, you can see candidates' plans for instruction build on each other within a meaningful context that supports the learning of. Okay? So the meaningful context means that you're addressing who your kids are, you've addressed well what the content should be, your central focus is clear, you want to have all of that in line, and you want those things to be in line with the essential literacy strategy. Okay, and it's going to be comprehending or composing text. But to get to the level 4, you need to consider this one, right? So you're supporting the learning of the essential literacy strategy with clear and consistent connections to related skills. Okay, so the difference between a 3 here and a 4 is this consistent connections. All right. So you want to be talking about related skills throughout your planning. It should be evident that your related skills fill every single one of your plans, and that you can address them clearly in your commentary too. So you can see how it takes to move from one to the other. From a 3, you have lessons that build on each other. On 4, they work within a meaningful context. A 3, clear connections. And a 4, it's clear and consistent connections to related skills. All right? So that's how you move from a 3 to a 4 on this first rubric. Let's go to this next one, the second one. All right. On this one, Planning to support varied student learning needs. How does the candidate use knowledge of his or her students to target support for students' literacy learning? And as I've said throughout this talk, you're thinking about all your kids all the time in all the varied ways they learn and what they bring to their learning. You're not teaching a lesson to a homogeneous group of kids in one singular way. So, if we look at 3, it says planned supports are tied to learning objectives and the central focus with attention to the characteristics of the class as a whole. This one's not reaching very much, all right? So to get a 3, you just have to write about how you're teaching a lesson for the whole class. Well, that's not what we should strive for. Let's see what 4 offers or asks us to consider. If we look here at 4, first, planned supports are tied to learning objectives and the central focus. Okay, so that's similar. But now look at the second part here. Supports address the needs of specific individuals or groups with similar needs. So this second part is the part that moves you from a 3 to a 4. Both of them require that that your planned supports are tied to learning objectives and the central focus. That should be a given. But to get a 4, you need to be addressing how you're supporting the learning of all your kids based on your knowledge of what they bring to the learning and other cultural contexts, etc. So this is how you move to a 4 on this second rubric. On the third rubric, okay, you're using knowledge of students to inform teaching and learning. Level 3, you justify the learning tasks and or their adaptations, and you want to show why they are appropriate using examples of students' prior academic learning or personal cultural community assets. Pay attention to this word "or" here. You'll see that it's not over here. Okay, so you want to talk about what learning they bring to this task, to the learning segment you're setting out, but also who they are outside of school. Okay, so this is a school-like frame for kids, but who are they that is greater than what they are in school? Okay, so remember I shared with you the glossary which described what these look like. Okay, so this is an "or" statement, and then down here, candidate makes superficial connections to research or theory. Okay, to move to a 4, you want to see that the candidate justifies why learning or why the learning task or their adaptations are appropriate using examples of students. Okay, so we've got the prior academic learning, and then we've got the word "and" their personal, cultural, or community assets. So you just want to make sure that you do both of these things, and you'll find yourself getting a 4. And then the difference between the last statement, candidate makes superficial connections. The last one is candidate makes connections to research and or theory. So the suggestion here is that you're not grabbing and pulling out research papers and ideas that you can tack on to your commentary. You want it to be focused on literacy. So whatever you've read in a literacy methods course about what makes for good writing, what makes for good reading, those are the kinds of things you want to have in your commentary, because they're not so general that they're not specific to what it means to be learning to read and write. So make sure you work from those things. All right? The fourth one, in this one, identifying and supporting language demands. How does the candidate identify and support language demands associated with a key literacy learning task? Okay, so a 3 is general language supports address use of 2 or more language demands. Okay, so this is quantitative. So you want to have your given vocabulary, language function, syntax, or discourse. All right. So you were just addressing those, all right? And it could be any 2 or more of these. But let's shoot for a 4 and see what a 4 asks us to do. A 4 asks us to think about it a bit differently. Instead of general language supports, we have targeted language supports. And the targets are vocabulary. The target might be language function. The target might be syntax. The target might be discourse. All right? It's not just overall how is language happening in your course, in your lessons. So targeted language supports address the use of vocabulary and the language function. So you have two of these essentially. You have to have both of these. So you must write about vocabulary and you must write about the language function. Then you can have a choice between the syntax or discourse, but there's no good reason not to do all four of them. All right? So essential difference between a 3 and a 4, we move from general to targeted. We also move from any two or more to necessarily including vocabulary, the language function, and either syntax or discourse. All right? And the last one. So this is planning assessments to monitor and support student learning. How are the formal and informal assessments selected or designed to monitor students' use of the essential literacy strategy to comprehend or compose text and related skills? Okay, so when you're setting out your assessments, you need to make sure your assessments are addressing both the essential literacy strategy and your assessment also addresses the related skills. Okay, let's look at what we have. 3. Level 3 says the assessments provide evidence to monitor students' use of the essential literacy strategy and related skills during the learning segment. That's pretty plain. So if you have your planning set out and your assessments focus on the essential literacy strategy and all the skills that set up and support the essential literacy strategy, then you will have a 3. But let's take a look at what's required for a 4. With a 4, we move from provide evidence to assessment provide multiple forms of evidence. So that's where you have lots of informal assessments along the way. Checks for understanding, a quiz, an exit ticket, a discussion in which you video recorded, all the ways in which you might collect evidence along the way. So it's not just random evidence. You're using evidence all the time, the way a teacher might and should. Now the next piece to this is that the evidence should monitor the student's use of the essential literacy strategy and related skills. So that's no different than here, the essential literacy strategy and related skills. But look what happens here. It's not just during the learning segment, it's throughout the learning segment. So what you want to have is that in every single one of the lessons you plan, you want to have informal lessons, checks for understandings, quizzes, whatever, in every single lesson you teach. And by doing so, then you will be meeting this requirement to be considering students' learning throughout the learning segment, okay? Not just sometimes during the learning segment. So consider this throughout part to be essential. All right? So in this talk, I've gone through edTPA, Elementary Literacy Task 1 for planning. I've given you a lot of things to think about, and I've stopped along the way to go into detail about key terms and key ideas. I've also given you a sense of what you should be focused on through the rubrics. And if you really do think about the rubrics as a tool to make your learning good and do well by your teaching, then you'll be fine. And as I will suggest again, shoot for level 4, and it will make you much more confident in your teaching. It will also set you up to learn a lot about your teaching along the way. So this assessment shouldn't just be about passing a test. It should set you up to learn how to be a better teacher. So I do hope this has been helpful.